Hey everybody, Eric here. I'm excited to announce that we have just launched our online paranormal merchandise store over at unseenparanormaltees.com. That is unseenparanormaltees.com. And we have designs of shirts for all ages and sizes. And we have a little bit for everybody over there. Right now, we have a line of t-shirt designs and of can koozies. We will be expanding the products that we offer in the near future, and we want to become your one-stop shop for all things paranormal. And for a limited time, using the code PARANORMAL, you will get 10% off orders over $25, and we always offer free shipping on orders over $50 in the continental United States. So head on over to unseenparanormaltees.com. That's unseenparanormaltees.com. And we thank you for listening to the show. Enjoy this episode. Welcome to another episode of The Unseen Paranormal, where some of the scariest things are unseen. I'm your host, Eric Freeman. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Today we're talking with the author of Ghosts of Greystone, Beverly Hills, Clete Keith. Clete worked in an office at the mansion for over 2 decades and decided to write about the Doheny estate after experiencing paranormal activity and hearing stories from guests. The book includes the history of the Doheny family, paired with photos and 237 stories from 86 people that he collected over the course of 3 years. You may recognize Greystone Mansion from movies such as Spiderman, The Big Lebowski, Batman and Robin, X-Men, and many more. Today we're going to chat with Clete about the history and hauntings of the beautiful Greystone Mansion of Beverly Hills. Ghosts of Greystone Beverly Hills is available on Audible, Amazon Kindle, and you can get a signed copy of Ghosts of Greystone at ghostsofgreystone.com. Hey, Clete, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Eric. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it very much.
So you spent a lot of time with having your office in this place for 20 years. So you worked for the city of Beverly Hills, who owns the mansion now. What got you wanting to write a book?
Yeah, the main thing was having worked there for, like you said, for 22 years, it was a normal lifestyle to go to work. I actually worked on the property. So there's the mansion itself, then down below in the southern part of the property is what's called the gatehouse. And so my office was out of the gatehouse for about 20 years. And then the last 2 years were up in the firehouse. They had their own fire department, little firehouse up on the property as well. And I transferred up to there. But I had no clue of wanting to ever write a book about Greystone, about the ghost of Greystone. It just wasn't on my radar. And it gradually became interest to me over the years when so many things kept happening and at an amazing pace where you would find somebody, because I worked with the Ranger division. I worked with Recreation and Parks at that time, then Community Services. And so I would help put on events like a design show or a car show, or we had art shows and Halloween events and all that stuff. I was part of that. So I was busy with that. But at the same time, having worked at that property, I was always in the mansion. Most every day I'd go in the mansion, and my friends were the Rangers. So only people that had access to the mansion could get in there. You couldn't be the public and just walk in. It's not open to the public in that way. So it became a thing where I would start hearing from other guys saying, "Oh my God, did you hear what happened to such and such?" And over a period of 20 years, it just became a thing of like, when I thought, I'm going to eventually get out of here. And I think I should just write down the stories that I've heard over the years. And I started that. And then once I did that, I went, I should talk to Steve, because he had that thing down in the basement. So I talked to Steve, and then he would have 18 stories over his span of having worked there. And he said, you should talk to Gabe, or you should talk to Luz. And then it became 83 people. I had at one point over 300 stories, and the editor called us and said, "Hey, you're at 700 and some pages now." I'm like, "Oh my God, no wonder it took 3 years to write this thing." So we backed it off. I took out 50 stories, and we ended up with 520 pages. But it's all real stories. This is not stuff made up or anything. These are interviews with people that are friends of mine, some that I never knew that came forward, and talking to them about what actually took place with them. And it astounded me just because I didn't know there were that many people had that many incidences and encounters.
It's got a long history and some history of murders and suicides and other people dying, and it's just got this huge history. And then like I was saying with the Hollywood history, there's so many movies. When you look up the list on like Wikipedia, so many movies is filmed there, and it's just iconic in movie history. But how did the estate start out? I know it was built in 1928, and it was pretty expensive.
Yeah. The very beginnings of all this there was a guy named E.L. Doheny, Edward Lawrence Doheny, who lived in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and he came out in the late 1800s to find gold in L.A. Didn't find gold, but ended up getting involved. He saw a guy pulling a cart in downtown L.A. with all this black, looked like black rocks on it. And he went up to the guy and said, "What is this? What do you got?" And the guy said, "Well, this is oil. I mean, it seeps through the ground, hardens, and I just take it." He goes, "What do you do with it?" I sell it for fuel." So he and his partner, Charles Canfield, bought a small little plot of land, very small, near downtown LA. And they started with a pick and a shovel, Eric, a pick and a shovel, and they went down 150 feet. So that's 15 stories.
Wow.
With a pick and a shovel. Didn't find anything, went out and found a eucalyptus tree, as straight as it could be. And at the very end, they took off the branches. At the very end, they carved it into what was like a drill bit. And they lowered it down. I guess they did it with ropes and mules and things, and turned it and cranked it. And they got down 450 feet, which is astounding. It's 45 stories down. And they hit oil. And they started bringing up 7 barrels a day. Then with the money he made off the oil here, he went down to Mexico and honestly basically fleeced the Mexicans of their land, saw where oil was coming up, purchased the land from them. They were thrilled to get the money. And then he hit a 600-foot geyser, which is still one of the largest ever today, which is 60 stories high, capped it in 2 weeks, and became a billionaire overnight when a penny meant something. And then it became the Rockefellers and the Dohenys. And that was him, Edward L. Doheny. He came up, he bought 429 acres, which turned out to be the area of Beverly Hills. And of that 429 acres, he gave his son, Ned, a 12.5 acreage parcel. And with that, Ned built Greystone. And just so you know, Greystone it's poured cement. So Frank Kaufman, who built the LA Times building out here downtown and also the Hoover Dam, he was a cement guy. So he ended up building this like a fortress. He poured cement with rebar. And then the outside was faced with Indiana limestone. And as we know, in the paranormal field, limestone is a conductor of energy.
Yeah.
Stephen King wrote The Shining at the Stanley Hotel in Colorado, which is built on limestone and is extremely haunted. And so he faced it with Indiana limestone, Welsh slate on the top, and there's Vermont slate for the walkways and the courtyards. And it is a 46,000 square foot home, 55 rooms, 67 altogether, meaning walk-in closets. And it has a family area, a servant's wing, a recreation wing, a hidden bar in the recreation wing down below, the bowling alley of There Will Be Blood, if you ever saw that film.
Yeah.
Okay, the ending of that is Greystone, is the bowling alley at Greystone. And along with that, the area had a greenhouse, horse stables, car garages, gatehouse down below, the firehouse, like I mentioned, and formal gardens. And it is, and that's just what's there now. They also had like badminton courts and tennis courts and dog kennels and swimming pools and a three-quarter scale dollhouse at the north end of the property for their daughter. So when it was built, it was started February 15th, 1927, and it was completed in September of 1928. So that's, for a house that size, it's incredibly fast. You couldn't get permits today to even start, let alone finish the home. So the family moved in September of 1928, and the family meaning Ned, which is Edward's son, Ned and his wife Lucy, their daughter Lucy, and 4 boys. They moved in September 1928, and then February 16th of 1929, he was lying dead in the mansion. So he was only there about 4 months.
Yeah, that's a pretty incredible story for a family from Wisconsin that, they were pretty lucky in the beginning, because the story gets a lot darker as you go on with this family. But yeah, it's almost like, I hate to say this, but it reminds me of like the Beverly Hillbillies, coming, they just struck oil by luck and become these billionaires overnight.
Yeah, and I wonder even if that was based upon that family. I never thought of that. But yeah, it was a stroke of luck, but it also became their downfall. They ended up getting into the Teapot Dome scandal, which is a whole thing we don't really have to get into. But because E.L. Doheny was an oil man, a lot of corruption came along with it, himself included, and he got caught, and that was the beginning of the downfall of the family. So,
yeah, and they only stayed in the mansion, occupied it until what, 1955?
That's correct. So after Ned died 4 months into it, she married the financial advisor, Lee Batson was his name, and they stayed there until 1955. Then they sold the home to a man named Henry Crown, who was part of building the Empire State Building. He had financial assets and things out of Chicago. And so they thought he might move into the mansion from Chicago. And I think his wife, basically said, hell no. After the murders and suicides and all the stuff in the mansion. So he did have financial holdings and things happening in Chicago. So he just held on to it from 55 to 65 and allowed people to shoot films in it and stuff, and then eventually sold it to the city of Beverly Hills. So, and then the city of Beverly Hills had it, and they rented, in essence, the mansion and the whole property out to the American Film Institute from 1969 to 1982 for $1 a year. So they allowed them to make it their campus, and they came in and they tore the place up. It's pretty. Now that it's an historical site, you look back at what happened when AFI was in there, and they stole everything out of the house, all the doorknobs, all the stuff that they just basically tore it up and made it, screening rooms for films and all that stuff, which it wasn't a historical site at that time.
Right.
But by then the damage had been done. So.
Yeah. And I kind of mentioned the murders and suicides. So there was the family pretty much from the get-go with this house was kind of plagued by their kind of downfall. Started with a pretty weird situation with a murder-suicide of Ned and his secretary.
That's correct. So Ned and his secretary, Hugh, and they had been friends, I think, since they were like 17. So Ned hired Hugh as like his secretary guy to oversee the mansion. So what happened was, once Edward L. Doheny became very well known, he had a lot of cronies and friends, and one was Albert Fall. And Albert Fall became the Secretary of the Interior in the Harding administration. And what happened was Edward went to Albert and said, they talked about other oil areas in the United States in which he felt he could tap into and make more money, Edward. So he went to Albert Fall and said, hey, there's a place called Elk Hills out here, and there was also Teapot Dome, Wyoming, that's still there, that has the oil reserves. So I think it was Harry Sinclair, there's Sinclair Oil out here, some gas stations out here. Sinclair got, I think, Teapot Dome, and Edward got Oak Hills and Buena Vista, all these other places out in California. And they were making money. And so what Edward did was he sent his son, Ned and Hugh, to New York, had him go to a bank, pulled out $100,000. This is back when a penny meant something, remember?
Right.
Pulled out $100,000, put it in a satchel, and they delivered it to Albert Fall and said it was a gift. Later on, he said it was a gift. Suddenly, Albert's lifestyle became quite lavish, and people going like, what the hell happened with Albert here? What is this about? So they looked into Albert and found out something had taken place. So they really looked into it and then ended up finding out that he received this money. He went to a trial. He lost in that trial, and he went to jail. And then they were going to go after Edward L. Doheny. But they felt, why don't we go after the son and his secretary who delivered the money to get to the father? There was a lot of speculation that Hugh wouldn't be able to withstand a trial, that he would crack and spill the beans. And so the family is trying to tell him, why don't you go into what was called a sanatorium back then and say that he would go in there for cocaine. And what they did back in those days was they used cocaine for your teeth. If you had pain in your teeth, you could use cocaine to take care of the pain. And then people got hooked on it, and they had to go to sanatoriums to get through it, to get out of the cocaine addiction. They said, they mentioned this to Hugh. Now, this is a speculation, but this is what I have read. They mentioned this to Hugh, and he was like, hell no, you're not going to let me out. I know too much. I don't trust it. And they think that the night of February 16th, 1929, he went to the mansion to confront Ned about this situation. They'd been drinking. They went into what's the South guest room. We when we worked there, we call it the murder room, but it's the South guest room. And there was a gun that came out. We don't know if Hugh brought it or if Ned had it. And Hugh either shot Ned in the head and killed himself, or the other way around. Ned shot Hugh, then killed himself, having killed his friend. And there are photos, for those who are into that kind of thing. There are photos in the book that are pretty gruesome, but they're from the police department. We got them, and it shows the situation within the home, and it's pretty horrifying. But it was portrayed in the newspapers and stuff that like Mrs. Doheny was on the opposite end of the home, where she was actually in the room next to that room, in the living room, this big room. And she said she thought she heard a chair that fell over. So something was up there. She knew more than she was saying.
Right.
And the newspapers, well, within 24 hours, Eric, it was done. It was the biggest scandal of its time, but it was over in 24 hours. And that's what money can do, basically. They just said, it's over, it's done. And the police department said, of course it is, Mrs. Doheny. So that's what happened at that night. And it raises a lot of questions as to, did that bring on the other horrible things that took place around that property from that dramatic night?
Yeah, and you kind of can't blame Hugh for not wanting to go in the sanatorium, because back then they weren't the nicest places, and they did really bad things to people in some of those places.
Yeah.
And also, once you were committed, like you were saying, he's afraid he wouldn't ever get out, because you could commit somebody. Men back then would commit their wives for hysteria because they wanted to get rid of them.
Exactly. That was a whole another scandal with the head of the American Medical Association. He did that. They called it gaslighting. And he did that with his wife. He almost got away with it, but he didn't. But yeah, that was the case. And man, I'm telling you, Ned and Hugh are still within that home. They're still there. And I know that for a fact, because I went in one night with a friend of mine who's still working there, Ranger Dan Hernandez, and we went in at night, 11 o'clock at night, with a spirit box that I'd never used before. Thought it was a joke. Brought it in there. I said, let's just try this, because I bought this thing. Might as well try it. So we went in there, and I asked for, if there was anybody in there, please come to this red light, because it was completely dark in there. And a voice came out and said, Ned. And I looked at Dan and went, did he just say? I think he said, he goes, I think he said Ned. I said, Ned, if that was you, would you do that again? In a different voice, Hugh.
Wow.
So I went, oh my God, they're still here.
Yeah, and a lot of places like that with something that traumatic, for whatever reason, they don't move on. Whether they're stuck in, don't feel like they're worthy, or because, one killed themselves, the other one murdered somebody. Yeah, they're just kind of stuck there. Or I guess they could be there by choice too.
I think it's both, Eric, and I'll tell you why. We have a break room inside the mansion, the second floor. It's a room where a maid actually committed suicide, and that became our break room. So what happened was, I went in there one morning with my recorder, and I asked, just knowing that there had been some some activity within that room, and I asked, if there's somebody in here, are you here because you're afraid to move on? Because you don't know what's going to happen when you get to the other side? And I listened back to the recording, and the answer said yes.
Wow.
So that could have been Ned. Remember, this was a Catholic family, and to commit suicide was a sin. So there was a whole thing going on there that they didn't want to. They didn't want to move on because they were afraid to find out what would happen to them for having done what they did in this life. Also, to add to that, here's why to me it's very odd in that once this took place, the murder-suicide, they buried Ned at a cemetery out here with a huge memorial. And 30 yards away on that same hill is Hugh's plot. Now, if I've got $1 billion, I can do whatever pretty much I want.
Right.
And if this guy kills my wife or whatever, I'm not going to have him in the park. I'm not in the cemetery, let alone 30 yards away from me.
Right.
So what that said to me was, I think something took place, and I think Ned shot Hugh, then killed himself. And out of what have I done? This is one of my best friends. This is going to cause a stir, and he just couldn't deal with it, and he just killed himself. So I think that's kind of what took place.
Yeah, and with that kind of money, like you said, within 24 hours, it's kind of swept under the rug. And with that kind of money, and if they were already, the family was already bribing, the president's administration, it would have been easy to bribe the police and the papers and even maybe the family of Hugh to keep their mouth shut.
No question. It's a good point. Very good point. And I'm sure that was done. I'm sure they said, look, in essence, saying, we don't know what happened that night, but here's some money, stay quiet.
Right.
And I'm sure they did that with the police department. They paid them off and said, well, give some money to the fund and everything. Just please leave us alone and close this investigation. It's so painful for Mrs. Doheny, that type of thing.
Yeah, and the police department, like Beverly Hills and Los Angeles, now they're throughout the past 100 years, they've had a kind of sordid history with things like that anyway.
You bet. Yeah, I have a friend named Clark Fogg who has written a book about the murders and mysteries of Beverly Hills. It's a really good book, and it has so many photos and things of all the people, that actors and things, and all the stories behind what took place and everything. He was in essence the forensic guy from Beverly Hills. Became a friend of mine and wrote the foreword for the book. He was there for 30 some years, and man, he knows all the story. He's an incredibly nice guy, but the stories he started talking about, I asked at one point, well, like what? What did you do there? And he told me that he was there the night of the Menendez brothers who killed their parents.
Yeah.
He lived 2 doors down.
Wow.
So they called him up and said, hey, go next door. Something just took place over there and check it out. And he was one of the first to walk in and see what he saw. I won't get into it now, but it was unbelievable what he told me.
Yeah.
Crazy. So the whole Beverly Hills is just kind of, it's fascinating, interesting, but it's kind of dark too.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's other houses in Beverly Hills that have sordid histories the same as Greystone has.
And haunted too,
right,
Eric.
Right.
A lot of these homes, when I lived not too far from Greystone. I lived at I won't say who it is, but I lived at there's a really big, huge home off of Sunset there that I lived in a house behind that home. And that home itself had activity. It used to be Cole Porter's. He was a a composer, Cole Porter's Night and Day, and he lived there in the I think it was the 20s and 30s, whatever. But that place had an actual American Indian spirit on the ground. So they were filming I haven't told this to anybody, but they were filming a commercial one day on that property. And there's a river that flows. Welcome to Beverly Hills. There's a river that flows through that property. You turn it on. There's a switch that turns on a river, and it flows through the property, then recycles back up. It's really actually kind of beautiful. But they were shooting this commercial, and this actress was there. I won't say who it is, but she was there, and the crew was down by the river and setting up lights and stuff like that. And came back, and the one guy in the crew says, Who's the guy down there? And everybody's looking around. They go, what? They go, who's the, he's like an Indian guy down there. And another guy goes, I thought he was on your crew. And the guy goes, no, he's not with me. And so then the woman who owns that property was asked, is that guy, does he live on the property with you? And she said, well, he kind of. And they're like, what does that mean? Well, he came with the property. And the woman who was the actress there left, walked off, didn't come back. It freaked her out too much. So point being, around there is a lot of the place that I lived on that property was actually kind of mellow. It was kind of cool. And then when I left, another guy moved in who worked at an antique shop and brought his antiques and stuff in, and it went crazy.
Wow.
The place went nuts. Mirrors cracking, people looking in windows, doors slamming. So he goes, how did you live there? I go, I never had any of that stuff. You brought it in. I didn't have it there.
And with Greystone, there's been others. Like you said, there was one maid who killed herself there. And there's also reports of a little girl ghost that has been seen by kids and some other people as well.
Yeah, so from what I know, and there are probably even more than I don't know, from what I know, there were two maids that killed themselves. One slit her wrist, and inside what's known as the meat locker upstairs. So she went in there. It has a drain, and they used to hang meat, like the deer and stuff, that they would release. It's just horrible, but they would have the butlers release animals outside. It was, a lot of acreage. And then the men would stand on a balcony and shoot them.
Yeah.
Very, very manly. So,
right.
Then they would grab the deer or whatever they've shot, put them in a dumbwaiter, send it up to this kitchen on the second floor, and they would dress the deer there and then hang it in this meat locker that they had there. That had a drain, so in case there was any blood. Well, this one maid went in there. I think we know why, but she went in there and she slit her wrist in that room so that her friends wouldn't have to clean up after her, clean the blood up. Further down that hallway, which was our break room, a woman hung herself in that room. And we think that the reason that these two hung and slit their wrists was that they were, remember, it was a Catholic household, and most of the people that came in back in those days were from Ireland and England, and they were Catholic as maids. And Greystone had 34 servants at a time during the day, and 17 of those, right around 17, lived there. So they had rooms that they would stay. That being said, from what I understand, I don't want to get in trouble here, but how do I say this? There was a man in the home. I'm going to leave it up to you to figure it out. There's a man in the home that would go after the maids and have sex with the maids, and they say those were the two that got pregnant. And in a Catholic household, they have sinned, and then they sinned again by killing themselves. And so maybe that's why they're still there, if indeed they are. So that's two. The little girl you're talking about was an interesting story. I walked into the mansion one day, and there was a group of that getting ready to shoot. They're on what's called a scout, and they go and they scout the location. They look inside the mansion, outside, wherever they're going to shoot their shots for the show, and they're there talking to the lead rangers, the senior rangers about what they're going to do. And it's all written down so they know exactly what they're going to be doing. There are no surprises. And so when I walked in, this one woman who was with that group looked over at me, and with her eyes, I could tell something had happened to her. And I went, oh no, I'm going to get out of here. And she goes, excuse me. I went, oops, yeah. And walked over to her, and she said, in a whisper away from the other crowd, is this place, you know? And I go, no, I don't know. I always am like, I want them to tell me. I don't want to lead them in any way. So I just said, no, I don't know what's going. She goes, is it haunted? I said, why do you ask? And she said, ever since she was a little girl, she could see, hear, feel, sense spirits. And she said when she turned 15, she shut it down. It became too much for her. She couldn't take it anymore. She shut it down. And she said, but when I walked in here today and I'm standing with the crew, I look over and this little girl is running at me. And she's saying, my name is Emily. It's Emily. My name is Emily. She said, I was just looking at her, and she looked at the crew. They weren't acknowledging this little girl. And she went, oh my God, it's happening again. So she walked away, and the little girl followed her, and she went around the corner away from the crew. And she said, okay, your name is Emily. Don't do this to me. Please don't follow me. Don't do this to me. So she said, so my question to you is this place haunted? And I said, yes. Did a little girl die here? I said, yes. Was her name Emily? No. She goes, it's Emily. And when I first started working there and the stories came to me, we thought that Emily died upstairs in the daughter Lucy's room, playing in her room, fell out the window. You can actually, I'm looking at it right now, on the front of the book, there's a middle window there. And that's supposedly the window she fell out and landed on the terrace and died. So from that time on, I knew her name was Emily, and I would come into the house and say, Emily, it's Clete. I'm here, honey. I hope you're okay. And I'd talk to her. But in doing the interviews for the book, came across a guy named Glenn Gregory, who was a counselor for the kids' camp called Catskills up there. And when I talked to Glenn, because somebody said, you got to talk to Glenn Gregory. So I finally got a hold of him through all these phone calls, this, that, and got a hold of him. And I said, somebody said I'm supposed to talk to you. And he goes, oh, yeah. I said, well, what happened to you? And his story is he showed up one morning very early, like about 8 o'clock, let's say, 8 o'clock in the morning to get the camp ready. The camp starts at 10. He's there early. He pulls inside Greystone. He pulls up by the firehouse there and gets out of his Jeep, goes up the stairs to the firehouse, the second floor, and there are offices up there now. It's where one of my offices was. So there were rooms up there where he would get the clipboard and get all the stuff ready for the kids' camp. And when he walked out onto the landing that's out there, you would look straight across to the mansion rec wing. So you're looking like maybe 50 feet, 75 feet. There is the recreation wing of the mansion. And up above are these balustrades that line the top of the roof. So he looks up and he looks over and he sees this little girl all dressed in white standing there looking at him. And he said, Clete, I'm like, what? My first thought was, how did she get in the park? Park's closed till 10. Where are her parents who dropped her off? And what is she doing on the roof? And he looked at her like, hang on. And he turned and he starts to go down the stairs because he's upstairs. And as he starts to take a first step, he looks back to her to make sure she's still there. And he sees her get on top of the balustrades and jump off.
Wow.
Into the courtyard. And he snaps. He just was freaked out, ran down the stairs, runs into the courtyard, and he's looking for her, and he's freaking out. And some of the other counselors show up, and he's like, I'm going down the other side. Go to the other side. She must have run over there. They followed all the way up the hill to the top parking lot. Everybody covered an area to see if she was laying in the bushes or she's running away. And they went up to the top, and he's like, there's nobody here. So when I'm interviewing him, he goes, but you know, Clete, I could have just thought that up, though. And I said, really? And he goes, yeah. I mean, that could have just been my imagination. I said, well, do you remember what she was wearing? He goes, yeah, she wore a white dress. I said, well, then you weren't imagining it. You saw it.
Yeah.
And he was just quiet. He's like, man, oh my God, this is just, it really tripped him out. And then to add to that, Eric, in another conversation with a different person who worked with Glenn on a different day, like a month later, she was up there as well with little kids out on the balcony there. They were coloring and painting. She's in the room getting ready for the day, and she hears all these kids out there start screaming. And she said, I was a lifeguard, and I know the sounds of really screams of terror and screams of help. And she goes, she just tripped and ran out in the thing and said, what's going on? And they stopped screaming, and they pointed up to the roof of the rec wing. And she looks over and she's like, what? And one of the little kids said, there was a little girl in white, and she climbed up on the top of that and jumped off. So that corroborated Glenn's story.
Yeah.
So, which tripped me out, because then I went, wow, I have corroboration on a story that sounds fantastical, but it appears it was real.
Yeah, and that, I mean, seeing something like that would definitely stick in your mind. So the fact that he was trying to rationalize that maybe I just made it up.
Yeah.
You know, and then to get that corroboration that, no, you didn't make it up. All these kids, you know, saw this as well, and they wouldn't have, the kids wouldn't have been freaking out about nothing.
Right. And the amount of people that I talk to that come up with something, I have a certain phrase for it, but it's like when they come up with an excuse or something like that, where they go, oh no, I know what this was. Well, they're just trying to rationalize the fact that they don't understand what they've seen, so it had to be this or that. Whereas right. I had many conversations. There was a guy who came. We had the theater that is there that we're going to have it renovated, which we have had it renovated by now, beautifully done. And the guy who was the head electrician showed up, and I didn't know him at all. It just became, hey man, how you doing? Hey, good. Started talking to him, and he came to me one day, and I said to him, I said, hey, Christian, have you ever seen anything odd happen here? I didn't want to tell him the place is haunted, because you lose workers. You know, you really literally do. They, oh, you kidding? I'm out of here. And so he said, well, yeah, something actually odd happened to me. I go, what do you mean? I didn't tell him anything. And he's like, I was in the theater, and I was measuring inside the theater and looking at the electrical, and this red light hovering in the air right by me, like a little light. I said, like an orb kind of thing? He goes, yeah. And he goes, but I thought maybe it was somebody behind me with a laser pointer. I said, but a laser pointer would be a laser. It wouldn't be a ball in the air. You'd see the laser light all the way through. He goes, yeah. And he said, but you know what? It's like sometimes when you hit your head or something, and you kind of see things or whatever. I said, did you hit your head? He goes, no. I said, it's okay, man. I have to tell you, this place is active. That's what I would never say haunted. I'd always say it's active. And they go,
yeah.
What do you mean by active? I said, well, there's still some spirits here, but nobody's ever been hurt, which is not true. But I have to tell them that. So I said to him, if you have anybody on your crew that's coming in and you find out something weird, I said, I'm writing a book. Come to me and let me know. Okay? He goes, okay, man, I will. So I would show up and I'd see Christian. They go, hey, Clete. I go, hey, man. He goes, hey, Clete. I go, yeah. And he points to some other guy. He goes, Ralph. I go, Ralph? Pointing. That guy, Ralph. You got to talk to him. I went, oh, okay. And that's how all these construction guys started talking to me, because I go up to him and say, hey, and some great stories. And one other guy would not talk to me. So I knew something had happened. They said, hey, he saw a little kid down in the basement. I thought it was Emily. So he's walking with another buddy, and I said, "Hey, man, how you doing?" He goes, "Good." I said, "Oh, hey, by the way, my name's Clete. I don't know your name." And he said his name. I said, "I heard something weird happened to you down in the basement." And he just stared at me. I said, I'm writing a book. No, I won't use your name. No, I don't want to talk about it, man. I said, "Okay, you got it." And he was a big guy. He just walked away, and I went, "Okay, sometimes you got to know when you can't push these guys, because it's so, it blows their mind so much that they have a hard time rationalizing what happened, and they don't want to talk about it."
Right. They're just there to do a job, and they're not there to
right.
see the spirits. So they have park rangers there. So rangers, I know with like national parks and other places, tend to be pretty tight-lipped about the paranormal activity, but have any of the rangers ever had experiences there?
The whole book, you can't imagine the amount of rangers, and it's rangers, but rangers having more than one story. I have a very good friend of mine who is the senior ranger there, who is now retired. His name is Steve Clark. And I asked him, because he was getting ready to move to Santa Fe, and I said, "Hey, before you go, would you come to Greystone, meet me there?" Because we worked together for 20 years there. And I said, "Meet me there, and we're going to take a little walk inside and go over your stories, because I'm going to try to write this book." And he goes, Okay. He showed up. We started out in the courtyard, things that had happened outside, and then we went inside the house, and I said, "Let's just walk through each room, and if you don't remember, I will, because I remember everything that's happened to you." And he goes, "Okay." I wanted it in his words. Right. And he ended up having 18 stories over a period of 20 years. So, wow. And amazing stories too, really crazy, like apparitions and screams and growls and demonic stuff and everything. So that was just one of, I can't tell you how many rangers I've talked to, and rangers that have retired or moved on, went to another job, but still had experiences there, because they were the ones that had the keys to have access to go inside. And that was part of their responsibility, to make sure that the house was secured.
Right.
So they were always inside there, and things were always happening to them, especially, Eric, if you have the gift. If you can, like Steve Clark had the gift. So they were constantly trying to connect with him, always doing things, moving things, saying things to get him to look to, because they could see he has an aura about him that they can connect with him. Other people like myself that don't have that gift or whatever, not so much. But Steve and Juan, this other Juan Andrade, who's still there, they are constantly doing things to get their attention so they can talk to him.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've always akin that to some people are a lighthouse in the dark. And so
exactly.
They're just kind of a beacon, yeah. So also you've been told a few times that there's a portal there.
Yeah. There was a man named Peter James. I don't know if you ever remember Peter James. And Peter James was a famous psychic. There's a lot of television shows in the early days when this stuff was just kind of coming out, in I would guess like late 80s, 90s, into the early 2000s. Peter James was the guy that would go on television and talk about, because he was a very good psychic medium. And he showed up one day, and Steve Clark was there, and he had some friends with him. He said, "I'd like to go in. I know all about this place. I'd love to go inside." He said, "Well, you can come in, but you can't bring any cameras or anything. This is not a television show, but I'll let you come in." He said, "Fine. I just want to come inside." So he went inside, and in walking through, he suddenly stopped on the second floor and pointed to a certain corner of the room and said, "Are you aware you have a portal here?" And Steve said, "No." Steve didn't even know what a portal was. And he said, "Yeah, you've got a portal here. It's right in this corner." And in that corner, he was pointing to which he was pointing. We would always get these amazing orb photos of these, and it was always in that corner. So I'm guessing it's like a highway to the spirits, that they can come and go.
Yeah.
And so later on, when Chris Fleming, who's also been on a lot of television shows, he showed up, became a friend. And I brought him in with another psychic and two other guys. And we walked around, and he walked in and looked up to that same corner and said, "Do you know you have a portal in here?" And I said, "Wow." Peter James said the same thing. He goes, "Peter James was my mentor. He taught me everything that I do right now." Wow. So it was pretty crazy. But there is a portal, and did that portal open because of the murders? Always been a question I have, because that night, Eric, it was like on the murder suicide, the amount of energy and that was so horrible within that home. I believe is still in there. Remember, it's Indiana limestone faces that. I believe that it's imprinted within the walls of that mansion. And I have sounds of gunshots like you can't believe. Amazing sounds of gunshots going off in that house. There's nobody in there. I'll leave my recorder for the night, pick it up the next day, listen to it, gunshot. And it echoes. So you know it's within the home. It's that sound is coming out within that home. It's echoing because there's nothing in that home. It's an empty home. So it's crazy.
Yeah. So much stuff there. And you've got so many stories in the book. And I'm fascinated by the history too, because that kind of, like you were saying, did the murder-suicide cause that portal and cause more activity? Because, you know, they built this house themselves on this empty land.
Yeah.
And yeah, there could have been stuff that happened on the land before, but, you know, there really wasn't any report. I guess most of those people are probably dead anyway, but probably not many reports of paranormal stuff before the murder-suicide happened.
Right. So remember, I don't know, and I couldn't find any, just like you said, anybody talking about the paranormal that built the home. And there were hundreds upon hundreds of people that built that home because it was done in such a short amount of time. They had hundreds of people. Did they have any activity? Don't know. It was Mexican land at one point? Was there something happening there that was cast on that land? Don't know. It was Indian land prior to that. So we don't know, but I will tell you that there were two stories that were told to me. One amazing story of a woman who was a security guard for one of the film companies. So the film companies came in to shoot. They were going to be there 3 or 4 days. So when they do that, they hire security guards, and the security guards stay outside the mansion and oversee the property, making sure nobody comes in and takes anything or gets in any of the generator trucks and all that stuff. So this woman was standing at what's known as the 905 gate, 905 Loma Vista Drive. You can look that up, Google it, and map it, and you'll see the entrance to the park, 905 Loma Vista Drive. And the gate was locked there. And she was standing there, and that was her post for the night. And as she's standing there, she said right around 11 o'clock, she starts hearing this clip-clop coming. And she's like, what is that? And she's looking up a hill, because when you enter the park, you go up this steep hill. So she's looking up toward the hill, and around the corner comes this guy on a horse, and it's riding slowly down the hill toward her. And I said, were you afraid? And she said, no, not really. Come to find out, she's had things happen to her before, so maybe she has the gift. I'm kind of thinking she did. But regardless, you're in a place that's dark as it can be, and here comes a guy around the corner on a horse. And she said it was a beautiful white and gray horse. He had chaps, a long white shirt, and a sombrero that covered his face. You know, wouldn't you know it? That's not a horror movie. So you can't see
right.
You can't see. It's like shadowed, so you can't see his face. And he comes down halfway and stops. And she's looking at him. He's looking at her. She has a little flashlight. And as she holds up the flashlight, the guy and moves the horse off the road onto there's a dirt trail that leads away on the property, but leads away from the mansion. And it's riding the horse. She runs up, turns on the flashlight, runs up that hill, and once she sees the horse clopping away from her, and she holds the flashlight at that horse, the flashlight goes out. Once the horse turned the corner around these bushes, the flashlight came back on. So it's stuff like that. Was that guy from when the Mexicans owned the property? Because she thought it was a ranger there at night. And she went to one of the gardeners next day. Do you have rangers on horses here at night? He goes, what are you talking about? It's crazy. It's just so nuts, man. So many stories like that are just like, but when you hear the people tell it and you look at their face when they're telling it, you know it's real. You just know it's real.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of the people, like you're talking to construction workers, they're there, like we were saying, in the capacity of working. They're not there trying to ghost hunt so what would they have to gain by making these stories up?
Absolutely. And they don't know I'm writing a book, right?
Right.
They don't know the place is haunted, like you said. They don't know anything about the location. They're there to work on the electrical or the air conditioner, what have you. And they don't know that some knucklehead who works there is going to write a book about all this stuff. So when I hear that this Ralph guy went down underneath the theater into this one really small room, and Ralph was a big fella, and he's down in this room where you could hardly turn, and he said he's pulling the head of these electrical cables. And he said, I'm down there pulling this head. I'm having a hell of a time because it's cramped and it's a small hole to get this through. And I'm yanking on it going like, my God, how am I going to get this through? And he says, and as I stop there to take a breath, in my left ear, I hear, do you need some help? And he's like, he looks behind him and goes, come on, man. And calls out the guys and says, what did you guys say? And they're like, what? They're outside. Did I need what? What are you talking about? All that kind of thing. We didn't talk to you. We're not saying anything. And he said, I knew somebody was in there with me, but there was no room. But I knew I could feel them over my shoulder, right next to me. And he said, that tripped me out, man. And he's stuck in there. He couldn't get out. And this thing's right next to him saying, you need some help?
Right.
So those stories to me, when I heard those, man, I'm just like so excited because all I heard was, you got to talk to Ralph. And, okay. And that was his story. So it was like that throughout the 3 years of doing this, of just going like, oh, I'll meet you up there. I'll meet you up there. And I'll meet him up there and say, tell me what happened.
Yeah. And we could sit here for the next 3 or 4 hours and probably talk about stories, and you could tell all these different stories, but people to go and buy the book and check it out. And like I said, it is available. Ghost of Greystone, Beverly Hills by Clete Keith is available on Audible, Amazon, Kindle, and they can get a signed copy from you if they go order on ghostofgreystone.com.
Yeah. If you go to our website, and you're welcome to purchase it wherever you'd like. We love that. But at our website, I'll sign it for you. I'll send you a little message with it, and we also have add a couple other little gifts with it, and we ship it for free as well. So once we get the order, it's out that day. So it's just like Amazon, but you get a couple of extra gifts anyway.
Yeah. And I have not made it through the whole book yet, but what I've read, I think it's great. I'm going to continue reading it and get through it. Y'all were nice enough to send me a copy, and I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, I thank you so much for coming on today, Clete. It's been a pleasure, and I've had a blast talking to you and hearing the stories.
Well, it was great meeting you, first of all, Eric, and thanks for being so kind, and best of luck with the podcast. I love it, and I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you so much. All right, everybody, that is it for today's show, and we'll see you next time. As always, stay safe out there. Have a good day. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, head over to the Unseen Paranormal Lounge on Facebook for all the latest updates and discussions about the show. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, or at unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And please rate, review, share, and subscribe to help more people discover the show. The Unseen Paranormal Podcast is proud to be the ambassador for paranormal for Verbal.com. A big thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. You can find more of his music on Apple, Amazon, or Spotify. And as always, thank you for listening.